Good morning, everyone. We're recording today's webinar for future viewing, and I've just started the recording. My name is Karen During, and I'm with the Virginia Institute of Marine Science at the Center for Coastal Resources Management, or CCRM, and I'll be the webinar host today. Assisting me as co-producer behind the scenes is Circe Gonzalez, the Coastal Training Coordinator at the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, and we really appreciate her help today. Welcome to part 1 of the 2020 Virginia Shoreline Management webinar series. This is the first of 3 webinars that we're hosting in place of the annual VIMS workshop that we couldn't hold in person this year. The next 2 webinars will be held on August 20th and August 25th, featuring shoreline law and policy updates and Living Shoreline's performance, respectively. We're very excited to have over 100 registered participants for each of these webinars, representing a variety of shoreline stakeholders and agencies, including a few out-of-state representatives. So welcome to everyone. Participant engagement during today's webinar include a chat box, raise hand, and a Q&A feature. Use the chat box to send us comments and feedback if you need help troubleshooting anything, if you have resources to share, or to ask general questions. Use the raise hand feature to get the host's attention. We will ask you to post a message or question in the chat box to clarify what you need. The Q&A feature is where you can post questions for today's webinar presenters. There's scheduled time for questions at the end of each of their presentations today. Click on one of the icons to open either the chat or the Q&A. Hit enter after you type the message to send it or post it. You can enter questions for the presenters in either the chat box or the Q&A, but we recommend that you use the Q&A feature so that your questions stand out for the presenters. With everybody that we have on today, we might not have time to get to all of the questions. So they're all going to be saved, and all unanswered questions will be saved and addressed after the webinar. Now I'd like to introduce today's webinar presenters. Marcia Berman and Pam Mason are both colleagues of mine at the VIMS Center for Coastal Resources Management. Marcia is going to speak first about a new interactive shoreline decision support tool and the CCRM Shoreline Management Model that it's based on. Then Pam Mason will talk about 2 new decision tools, including a shoreline management handbook and a tool that focuses on natural and nature-based features near shorelines and their connections and benefits for coastal buildings and communities. So Marcia, if you're ready and you want to turn on your video camera and start sharing your screen, you can take it from here.
Morning, everyone. I hope everybody is well. I am reporting from my office here at VIMS, which is not really where I spend most of my day. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. As Karen said, I'm going to talk to you about 2 shoreline decision support tools. One has been around for a little while. It's called the Shoreline Management Model, but there's a number of new folks here on the webinar, so I'm going to do a little intro of that. And then I'm going to move on and talk about a new tool that some of you may or may not know about. I'd like to acknowledge both of these products have been developed over several years with assistance and input from many of the staff at the Center for Coastal Resources Management, but I would be wrong not to call out Tammy Rudnicki, who is the GIS programmer and who has done all the programming behind all of this. And then lastly would be to, last but not least, would be to acknowledge the funding agencies who have made significant contributions to making all of this happen. So the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program out of DEQ has supported the development of the Shoreline Management Model over many years, and we appreciate that funding. Most recently, the NOAA Restore Science Program was contributed to the development of the Shoreline Decision Support Tool, which was actually developed for our some partners that I've been working with over the last 2 years in the Gulf of Mexico. So we have several decision support tools in the center, and some of the ones that you're familiar with is the decision trees. I highlight that only because I want you to know that the decision trees were really sort of the beginning foundation for the development of the management model. And the management model has been the foundation for the development of the decision support tool, which I'm going to tell you about. I'm really focusing on the last two today just because of time. So the management model, which is also known as the Living Shoreline Suitability Model, delineates BMPs or shoreline BMPs with a preference towards nature-based solutions for erosion control. And the model was actually developed in response to the implementation of the Living Shoreline policy in Virginia back in 2011. It is a geospatial model, therefore it requires GIS data to actually run the analysis. And we are currently running version 5.1 in the center, and actually in the Gulf of Mexico as well. So the model requires, again, a fairly robust geospatial data set, and we use our coastal inventory for the majority of the data that goes into the model. It follows a decision tree logic model, which has its roots in the decision trees that some of you are very familiar with. And it considers both shorelines that are defended and undefended. So on the left gives you some example of a flow chart or a decision tree matrix that actually is used to develop the model or the pathways that the model follows. So it begins with a series really of conditions. It works its way through the pathways using kind of yes or no queries, and it outputs a recommendation that would either consider a, shown here in green, which would be more living shoreline type options, gray options, which would be areas that are not suitable for living shorelines. And these red areas that you see up here are areas that are just a little bit too complex for one reason or another for the model to actually give you a specific recommendation. Over here on the right is what the model looks like in its GIS format using Model Builder. And within the center, we have decided to deliver this information to the end user through a portal. And this is in a map viewer. And this is an example of what that viewer might look like for the city of Hampton. So the model has a classification that kind of groups shoreline preferences or BMPs into three major categories. The first are living shoreline options, which would include non-structural living shorelines, more hybrid situations where you have a combination of vegetative and more hard structure like shoreline armoring, and the more heavily engineered systems like breakwaters. It also considers non-living shoreline BMPs because not all areas are suitable for living shorelines, particularly those that have already been managed with some existing erosion control or defense structure. And then these areas of special considerations. And these were those red areas that you saw on the flow chart just a few minutes ago. Note that we include, for example, ecological conflicts such as mangroves that may not be suitable or you see them in Virginia, but this is a model that has been applied now to the Gulf of Mexico and several selected areas up in on the East Coast of the United States. So it's not Virginia specific any longer. We deliver the model through this portal. It's called our Comprehensive Coastal Resource Management Portal. Here's a link to it at the bottom. And I think that you can Google this, or I believe, Karen, we're going to be sharing these links to the conference participants through following the conference. And I think some of you already have this link as well. So now I'm kind of going to move on to this second decision support tool. So first of all, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing it in part because there have been, we've noticed over the years that there's a significant amount of effort that and resources necessary to keep the model current. So by developing something that is actually on the fly and relies on user input for its data and not GIS, it allows us to keep the decision support tool much more current, and it also allows the resolution of the information that can be delivered and the recommendations at a much finer scale. So to the extent that the Shoreline Management Model is actually best for doing site planning, but also regional projects. So if you are looking at developing a fairly large restoration project along the shoreline, the management model can extend across multiple shoreline boundaries. But the Living Shoreline Decision Support Tool is really very well suited to dealing with very fine scale resolution because the user puts in information for a specific site. So therefore, it does have the capacity to yield outputs that are much more accurate than the model. So just for you techies out there, first thing to note is that the model, the decision support tool, remember, is not GIS based, but it does get its pathways, its decision support pathways from the Shoreline Management Model version 5.1 right now. It also has the flexibility to add in other conditions that the management model doesn't have because it's not dependent on existing GIS data. We use JavaScript to develop the actual programming for the user interaction, the responses. HTML is the building block for the structure of the website that serves this. And then we use CSS to kind of, for the design characteristics of the pages within the tool. When we developed this, and again, this was developed for partners in 5 different regions in the Gulf of Mexico, our goals were to develop something that was very flexible, that was ADA compliant. It could work on a smartphone, which is the little image that you see here. So you could actually be out in the field and answer your questions that way. It would be query-based. It would provide extensive amount of help support so that it could be used potentially by homeowners. It would return an answer right away, and that it would have an appeal to a broad stakeholder audience. So with that, I am going to make an attempt to go directly to the tool. Hopefully everyone can see this. I'm going to just take 1 minute here just to check to make sure that I have no chatting or anybody's having any issues that I can help with. I don't see anything. So this is the intro page for the Shoreline Decision Support Tool. It tells you, gives you an introduction. It gives you some basic information on how to use it. And then you can go, I'm just going to go right in here and launch the tool. There's not a whole lot of time here to actually explain all the ins and outs of this, but I'm going to tell you up front that if you can recall some of those red icons that were in the flow chart, what we try to do at the very start of this decision response tool here is to try and weed out some of the more complex types of applications that the decision tool is going to have to face. So while it might be not intuitively obvious why we're asking a question right here of, is this a residential canal? You'll see that we're trying to identify some of the more complex engineered areas right up front, or those that might have ecological conflicts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and go through a couple of examples to show you how the tool works. So the very first question here in the tool is to find out, is the area defended right now? So we have a choice here. You have three choices. Is it a bulkhead? Is it got a revetment? Or is there no structure? And if you're really not sure how to answer any of these questions, we've built in a whole series of helps for each one of the questions. So it gives you an example. If you don't know if you have a bulkhead, you could look here and say, oh, I've got a bulkhead or I've got a revetment here. So these questions have all been built in to the extent possible. So I'm going to say that we're working with a shoreline right now that's not defended. And I'm going to say that we're not part of a residential canal. Then it asks a whole series of questions to, again, try to get at the characterization of the area in general. Is there a marina present? Is the shoreline along a commercial or an industrial area? Is it next to a road or a parking area or a railroad track? Gives you some sense of how this area is already been impacted. If, for example, I had said it was defended along a commercial area, it would have given you a stop and said that this area has a lot of limitations due to the upland infrastructure, and that we recommend that you seek expert advice. I'm going to move this. I'm going to go back then and say that we don't have any of those. And then it's going to ask, try and get at, is there anything ecologically important about this area? So for example, if there were SAV present in the area, again, it will stop you and it will suggest that you go and discuss the area with your advisory agency. And you can actually click here and go to a menu that will tell you if you're in Virginia, what are the agencies in Virginia that you should contact with regards to those impacts? And hang on one second here. I'm trying to get out of this. And there we go. So let's go back. And let's just say there are no ecological conflicts in this area. Now we're getting into some more of the nitty gritty with the actual conditions. It asks you something about bank height. As many of you know, bank height can have a great impact on both what type of erosion is occurring, as well as whether or not you can actually grade the bank. So the first question is asking you, are you dealing with one of these really high cliff areas? And if that's the case, we want to know that up front, because erosion is sometimes not associated with the actual shoreline. It's actually could be happening due to offshore or upland runoff. So for simplicity and time, I'm going to say no. Then it asks a whole nother series. Can the bank be graded? Yes or no? What if you don't know how to determine that? Well, there's some help menus here where you can run through these questions, and it can tell you about determining some questions about your bank height and whether or not it can be graded or not. And then I can hide that panel. I'm going to say that the bank cannot be graded. It asks you how long the shoreline is. So and it's a basic question, is it more or less than 200 feet? I'm going to say that the shoreline is greater than 200 feet. It asks if there's a marsh present along the shoreline. I'm going to say that there is no marsh present. I'm going to say, and then it asks you, is there any beaches present? I'm going to say that there isn't. And remember, if you have questions about this, there are questions all along the way, or these little icons that can help you determine whether or not you have a marsh present, whether or not you have a beach present. asks about exposure or fetch. This one's a little more complicated for people. So again, you can look through here and there's some examples to help you determine what is the fetch along your shoreline, both present, both from on the ground and from the map view. So I'm going to say that this area that I'm dealing with right now has, well, I'll just say a low fetch environment. So it's a relatively sheltered environment. And then the last question it asks is whether or not it has the near shore depth. Is it shallow or deep? You don't know how to figure that out. You can actually go ahead and again, there's a panel here that will help you make those choices. So I'm going to say that it's shallow. And then I'm submitting my answer. And in the recommendation here, it gives a review of what the conditions are that I've put in, the question, how I answered my question. And it's made a recommendation for planting a marsh with sill. It gives you a description of what that means. It talks about some of the flexibility of how that can be, what could the sill be constructed of. What it doesn't do is it doesn't tell you how to build the sill, how big to make the sill, how high to make the sill. It gives you some pictures of what that might actually look like on the ground. And then if you are interested, you can actually, if you were trying to submit this for a report or something else, you can actually print this off as well. So create a PDF file. So let's say I wanted to go back and I thought, oh, I made a mistake. I have an area that is a high energy environment. I underestimated my energy. I want to change my answer. Or I started from the beginning and I had a high energy environment. Well, the planting of the marsh and the sill may not be appropriate any longer. And then the recommendation for this would be an offshore breakwater with some beach nourishment. You're not really sure what that might look like. It gives you some photographs of some settings and what that might look like in your environment. So that's really the crux of how the tool works. I'm trying to think if I've left anything out. I don't really think so. I have about another minute and a half to go. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I can show you. Again, the help, the agency contribution. So if you had questions in your recommendations, you could, oh, and I did also want to point out this, that we've been working to incorporate things, information such as where you might find, if you had a recommendation that had plantings, we've been trying to work in some resources that you can connect to directly in the tool of how to get to find out what kind of plants might be appropriate for your area. So I think with that, I'm going to stop and I guess go back to Karen and happy to take any questions.
So if anybody has any questions for Marcia, they can type it into the Q&A. I don't see any open questions just yet. There was one raised hand that perhaps that person could enter a question if it's for Marcia related to this tool. I can ask a question that I get all the time, Marcia, is about the Shoreline Management Model that this is based on. If you said it's up to version 5.1, is it like an app where you continuously are updating the model and there'll be new versions coming out, or will this tool sort of stay with the current decision flow diagram for the near future?
So I would never say that anything that we're doing here is static. The continued interest and uses for the model certainly continue. In fact, Pam and I have been working on a project right now that is looking at, and she's going to talk about that in one of the webinars upcoming. I think it's the 25th maybe, where we're looking at applications for the model for nutrient reduction credits. So where can we construct living shorelines? As new and better GIS data become available, we can continue to make updates to the model. And in the most recent 5.1 update came in response to the work we were doing on the Gulf of Mexico. There has been some interest in running this model up on the northeast coast of the US in New England. And so I know it's being run, it's been adapted to run in New Hampshire. And so with that, there would be more revisions to incorporate different environments. And the other thing I should say about the model is that as part of the work that we're doing with the NOAA, under the NOAA Restore grant, Tammy and I are working on a user's manual, which is designed for implementing the model in another area, but so it's designed for a GIS practitioner. It's not designed for an engineer or a homeowner or anybody who's reviewing permits. It is designed for somebody who has GIS skills and is charged with implementing the model in an area that is new or different.
Great, thank you. And we do have a question in the chat box now, or the question and answer. Do you have any plans to include construction companies that have experience in building living shoreline structures? I guess this would be as one of those additional sort of information out links.
Right. That's actually a better question, Karen, for you. Of course, we can't advocate businesses. I think somewhere, do we have a place, or is there a link like on some agency site of people who have done certain training, companies that have done certain trainings and are trained to do living shorelines?
This is a very common question that we get often.
Yeah.
And there are efforts throughout the Hampton Roads region to try to generate a list that's meaningful for sharing. And we don't have any kind of a certification program for living shoreline contractors. There is a certification program for Chesapeake Bay landscape professionals. And we can provide that list, a link to that list or directory in this tool. So
Yep.
Any kind of a list that's generated that's been vetted by another agency or organization, we could certainly include a link into this tool. So this tool is very flexible in that we can add new information and add new information links like this to it once they become available. But we don't currently at VIMS have any plans in the works to generate that list right now, but I do know that there is a great deal of interest in that.
Yeah, so any kind of existing lists that have been, as you say, vetted through other agencies, we are happy to link to that. And Karen, if you know of one or two, actually adding them in is a very easy task to do. So.
And I have another question that is based on the fine print that's showing on your screen right now about this recommendation is derived from basic shoreline conditions. Additional factors to consider include several things, so that this recommendation is not the final answer for what might be feasible or appropriate on that shoreline. It's based on the observations that were made by the tool. Is that correct?
Yeah, so you know, this particular tool asks a specific set of questions. So in any situation, there may be a question that we should have answered. And so I will say that I expect that this tool, because of its ability to be more flexible, that we will be adding and incorporating other branches for this. One of the things though that I see construction access shows here in italics. I don't anticipate this tool to become a guide for how to build your structure. It might provide a link to resources that can do that for you, but I don't anticipate, because that's very site specific, I don't anticipate the tool moving in that direction. But I should never say never.
Well, thank you, Marcia. It's 10:30, and if we do have a couple more questions that we'll try to answer directly for the benefit of everyone after the webinar. But for now, we're going to try to turn it over to Pam. If she is ready to share her video camera, turn it on, and Marcia, you can turn yours off. And Pam, you can start your screen sharing.
Okay, so
Great. Okay, you're good.
Working?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So yeah, folks, so I wanted to talk to you this morning again, and I want to reiterate what Karen said. It's sort of too bad we're not in person. I miss seeing people's faces and having the opportunity to have some of our side chats. But I wanted to review today a tool which is a new sub page of CCRM pages that is built on the content of what had formerly been a hard copy version of the Shoreline Management Handbook. Then it was called the Wetlands Handbook, but now we're calling it Shoreline Management Handbook. So I'm going to go over that. So first place, where do you start it? So again, it's under CCRM's website. So there's two places to get to it. Under the Comprehensive Coastal Resource Management portals, Marcia just mentioned, which is where the shoreline management practices and the tools are, and that's down here. Also, if you were to come in from the wetlands management perspective, or that side of our website, you can also get it there. So it's pretty easy to find. So this is the landing page, and just wanted to point out a couple things in the landing page. So first of all, this left column is on all pages, and it can be used for navigating back and forth between the pages. And so is this little crumb trail at the top. So just for once you're in the site, navigating in and out. I had project partners on this, and most specifically working with Angela King at the Virginia Coastal Policy Center and Clay Burnick. And also amazing assistance from Dawn Fleming at CCRM in our office. And this project was funded and supported by the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program through NOAA's grants. The whole site has lots of interaction and lots of drop-down lists and things, and I'll demonstrate what that looks like. The basic construct is these 9 different tabs or sections. And while we had basically completed most of the content and navigation for the site by mid-March, when we ended up with new legislation on July 1st, we just recently, within the past week or so, updated new sections to account for that new legislation. So here's our 9 sections, just really quickly. You know, basically it's, so why are we doing this? How are we doing it? Laws and legislations. What does the permit look like? What does it mean to be on a board? And how do I conduct a hearing? Where can I go and get some information and decision? Information about restoration for resilience, because there's a lot of restoration going on now, and sometimes it seems like it's confounded by the permit process. A whole section on compliance, and then another one on know your resources. So the website is built with the primary focus on wetlands boards members, but it is not limited information for them. Obviously, it can also be useful for shoreline management decision makers, the general public, academicians, students. So it's a pretty robust site with a lot of information. So I'm going to go through quickly each of the sites. And I did want to say that it would have been probably best to have been live demonstrating this, but over concerns of whether or not my computer might crash or the live system wouldn't work or it wouldn't move fast enough, I went ahead and set up these slides. So So this is a next best compromise, but we're gonna work with it. So the first page, background and purpose. So basically it's an overview of, you know, why do we manage wetlands in Virginia and beaches and coastal primary sand dunes? So it's a real brief overview of that. And I wanted to just show that in this box here, as I go through each page, I'm just going to highlight some of the functionality and some of the information in the page. So the background and purpose basically says, what did we do in Virginia? Where have we started? So we have the original preamble language from 1972, being that language is not legislative direction or mandate. It was removed by the Codes Commission and it got replanted into other parts of the current language in the law. We include the Living Shoreline policy and information about our Chesapeake Bay program commitments. And then there's a brief description of what those resources are and what kind of functions and values they provide for which they're protected. So here's another example. So anything with an arrow means it's a click through, so you can open up more information. It's either a drop down or it's a subpage. In this case, I'm just highlighting the piece of the newer policy. So the 2011 language is up through to the semicolon, and then this is the new language from 2020, past that point. So our next page is laws and jurisdictions. There's a lot of information on this page. As you can see, we start with the Tidal Wetlands Act languages. So for each state and local ordinance or state ordinance or federal ordinances, as it's appropriate, we list where the actual law is and we provide links to the code. If there's guidelines or regulations, that's under the guidelines bucket. And then we provide some information on definitions. And so we do that for each of the laws that are of relevance or may interact with decisions about making choices about how to manage tidal wetlands, beaches, or dunes. So in this case, I've just, again, highlighted a particular law that we're all familiar with, which is the Wetlands Act, most of which is in the Virginia Code 28.2, 1300, and the rest of those sections. And also then again showed you this is the new piece that's in 28.2 104, which is actually the part of the code that mandates the commission's actions and activities, the Marine Resources Commission. So our next page is the JPA page, or the permit information page, and that has links to the joint permit application, which a lot of people find particularly useful. It also has a very good tutorial, if you will, on what should be in a permit to make it complete. And through that list, it has the general information that's required on a permit, the signature pages, obviously appendices, which are where you add information about a specific type of project you're asking for, project drawings, information about CBPA, and then the new piece is the Living Shoreline Statement. That was a piece of a required legislation that was in this 2020 bill. And then we also link to permit databases and the permit information about permit fees that wetlands boards have used to process their permit applications. So again, on this list, we link through to other local authorities, state and federal DEQ and local wetlands boards. We have links to the Virginia General Permit number 4, which is for emergencies, the 2 Living Shorelines group permits. And then under here, I'm going to show another example of what that looks like. So if you click through on the required information for the JPA, one of the options is proposed activity. So under this general information, you see all these pieces. So almost every one of these pieces has a drop down that has a sort of a definition or an explanation of what that would be to provide that information. And often there's drawings or photographs that show what that looks like if you're not sure. And so for example, on this one under proposed activity, it says, these are the kinds of answers that would be good for you to explain in a proposed activity. So what it is and the linear structure, whether it's new or replacement, if it's a living shoreline, the sites, what about grading and tree removal, and other information. And then down here is just an example of what that would look like to explain, I'm requesting 100 linear feet of class 1 stone, blah, 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 blah. So we provide those examples to give people an understanding of what it looks like in order to give the information to the boards that they need to make those decisions. So the next section is being on a board. And this is an interesting piece because we do hear from folks fairly frequently that they're not always certain about what it means to be on a board. And so there's a little bit of a description of citizens boards in general and how citizens boards affect and direct policy. The important thing that seems to come out from this section is that to remember that a wetlands board, you are issuing the Virginia permit for tidal shoreline activity, and so you're representing the Commonwealth's interests in that activity. So what else about being a board member? So this section is really nicely done. Clay Burnick actually helped quite a bit on this. So having had many years of experience working with the Virginia Beach Board, and so questions like, is there a requirement to be on the board? Can board members hold other positions? Is there compensation? And you all are laughing, I know. What is the site visit process? How do you get appointed? And so just explaining those out. So each of those questions has a little description. I will point out here that there's some interesting things about being a board member and the structure of the board is that there is some variability among boards within Virginia in terms of the number of board members and sometimes some of the other requirements and some of the other pieces. So where there is some variability, we have done our best through lots of surveys and questions and phone calls to be able to identify that. So if there's a slight difference, it might say, for instance, a board can be 5 or 7 members, for instance, because there's not a requirement. There's a minimum requirement, but the provision of a 7-member board is allowed, but it's not required. So our next section is how to conduct a hearing. And this is really interesting because, again, we go through a very step by step, actually created this flow chart over here on the right to give you a sense of how and when things happen. Timing is a question that comes up quite frequently. What happens first? What happens next? What about, if we table a decision, things like that. So it goes through each of those. Of some interest is, and sometimes there's a less experience, and so there's some confusion over violation hearings because they don't happen as often as regular permit hearings. Closed meetings and informal sessions, and then we do review what happens in a review of a board decision when the Marine Resources Commission chooses to review a board decision. So conduct a hearing. Again, I wanted to show through these yellow circles some of the other functionality of our site. So if some of the information you'll note in these in our tabs or our buckets aren't necessarily specific just to that tab or that bucket. In other words, the information that we're talking about also relates to other places on the page. And so we do link, there are several places, many places within the website where we link back to other tabs that cover that information. So here's a really good example. So the Wetlands Board must hold a public hearing within 60 days after receiving a complete application. So what is complete? Well, if you want to know, you can go back to the Permit Information tab and see what that says you should have in your application in order for it to be complete. Another example here is down at the bottom for permit decisions. The board may grant in modified form or denied a permit. Decision requires a weighing and balancing of all beneficial and detrimental factors relevant to a proposal. Okay, and the board must consider these 3 things: testimony, health and safety, welfare, and then the development conforms with the standards, and then you can go back to laws and regulations and read those. So we do provide this internal connectivity to help people move around if they're not sure if that information was there, rather than repeating it. So we tried to keep the pages concise and easy to read, and use internal connectivity to address some of those internal navigation issues. Okay, so our next page is decision support and technical assistance. And you can see that really falls into a couple different buckets. So we have what Marcia was just explaining, the Shoreline Management Model. That links to, so these are links in blue, so you can link to the CCRMP page, so the comprehensive portal page, and or Adapt Virginia. Then here's a little explanation of the comprehensive management portals and the self-guided decision tools, which includes the static decision trees and the decision support tool. Also on that page, there's a lot of information about Living Shoreline's guidance and alternatives, including links to the training courses that are led by the Shoreline Studies at VIMS, and the Shoreline Studies also led the development of guidelines, collaboratively working with CCRM, so there's links through that. There's also access to the Shoreline Evolution reports that are done by Shoreline Studies, and then there's information on technical advice. So who do I ask? This shows up in more than one place on the website, so we're trying to make that easy to find. And then publications that have been done, peer-reviewed or gray literature publications by CCRM. But right at the top of that page, if you're not necessarily ready for decision support tools and you are there because you want to know, how do I figure out what my jurisdiction is and how to review an application, you go back to previous pages. So the next page is restoration for resilience and funding. So this is a combination of information. Several folks note that often when they are trying to do what they consider to be the right thing, and they're trying to restore or create tidal wetlands or beaches, that the permit process being developed as in a sort of conservative fashion as a protection mechanism for when wetlands are being proposed to be developed or impacted, it doesn't always fit well with when wetlands are proposed to being created or restored. And so we built in this information to try to crosswalk that and speak to the fact that one of the most important ways that that's being addressed is through the development of general permits, general guidance. So we link here, for instance, to the Corps' nationwide permit for living shorelines, and you can read about that. We also talk a little bit about restoration activities. So on this page, you'll find a little information about wetlands restoration, beach and dune, and repairing buffer restoration. In this case, you can see that we even have a little bit, we link to the page on thin layer placement. We link to information on living shorelines designs alternatives. And we also have a link to the native plants for wetland restoration enhancement guide from the city of Norfolk, which is a great resource if you haven't yet seen it. So then on that same page, we also have an overview of programs that are frequently used or can be applied for wetlands creation and restoration, sometimes also for beaches and dunes creation and restoration. I will say that some of these programs are not explicitly just for tidal wetlands. So some of them are bigger programs, but the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program, VCAP, which I know some folks are probably familiar with the fact that this has been used successfully to help offset as cost share for Living Shorelines projects. Living Shorelines are an approved practice under that list, so you can see that over here. We take the opportunity to give a really brief explanation of what the program is, and then we send you to their page. So we're not trying to reinvent any of this information. We're just trying to bring awareness and put it all together in one place. So that's true of these two. The Virginia Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund is the opportunity for fiscal institutions, local governments, PDCs to offer no cost or low cost loans for living shorelines construction. National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, a lot of folks are familiar with. They are a large granting organization that does work throughout the United States, but specifically has programs focused on Chesapeake Bay shorelines, and they support a lot of work in not only planning and design, but construction. So all levels of activity for wetlands and shorelines and natural and nature-based features activities. There are also some local government tax incentives, which are explained. And then we do note that the total maximum daily load, TMDL requirements and water quality benefits are a driver here. So that is explained as well in more detail if you click through to that page. So our next piece is compliance and other legal information. Again, really quickly, we have information about investigations, prosecution, monitoring, compliance, including examples of templates, violations and penalties, including explanation of the penalties and injunctions. And so you can see how you can click through to find those. And then at the bottom of that page, we have a fairly extensive list of court decisions and Attorney General's opinions. So this is just one example of an Attorney General opinion that's probably more familiar than some of the others. So I highly recommend you peruse through these. But this is the one that basically lends the thinking that wetlands boards can consider impacts on wetlands from projects that are outside their jurisdiction if it's going to affect the wetlands. That's this particular Attorney General opinion here. So know your resources, our last page. So this page actually has a lot of information, bits and pieces from elsewhere on the website, plus a little bit of new information, but it's sort of try to be a little bit more of a one-stop shop. So I'm new to the whole shoreline thing. Who do I need to ask? So there's this whole thing on who do I need to ask, okay? So I want to get some expert advice. Where can I get expert advice? So we point out our contact person at CCRM is for starting the process and who will collaborate with all our other scientists, Christine. We also provide a connectivity and a link to the VIMS Office of Research and Advisory Services and Shoreline Erosion Advisory Services. Also on this page, we have a PDF version of the website content. So if you're in a place where connectivity is an issue and you would like to have a hard copy or pieces of it, we have a PDF. I will tell you right now that does have to be updated with the latest updates from the new legislation. So I will have to go in and modify that PDF and reload it. There's also, these two pages are really helpful, frequently asked questions and a glossary. Frequently asked questions is a great resource. We took questions that we get all the time and did our best to answer them. And many of them provide links back to other places on the page. Then the other section that's hopefully informative is we have these administrative matters and we have all these templates. So if you ever were wondering about letters or you don't yet have a letter or you're not sure if you have a best letter, we have this long list of, these are letter templates that you are welcome to download and fill in with your local government's name and your date and whatever. So those are all links and you can get to those there in PDF form. And then finally, we have our training and how to get more information. Of course, we mentioned our wetlands workshop, which is what we're doing today in a different form. And also that our training coordinator, Karen During, who is our host today, can develop customized training on any of the content from our site. So I am finished with my presentation for now. So if there are any questions.
Thank you, Pam. If anybody has any questions for Pam related to the Shoreline Management Handbook, you can enter those into the Q&A or the chat box. And one of the questions I've already gotten about the handbook, which I've gotten a lot of compliments, Pam. I do have to thank you and Clay and Angela who worked very hard, Christine and Dawn who helped build the web pages, that it's been a very useful resource. But there are still people who would like to have that PDF. So that is something that kind of is an interesting question that we get, is how do we still get that hard copy for all that material? And maybe there's select information that they want to print out or share with Wetlands Board members. So that's a valuable resource that we will have to update simultaneously with the web pages.
Absolutely, yes. And as I said, we had some last changes right before we sort of finished our project and had redone the PDF, but as I pointed out, there have been modifications to 4 different pages, pardon me, just in the last week and a half. So we'll have to regenerate that PDF, and the place to find it is on that last page. Because it's compiled, it also is something that if for some reason there's some concern about accessing it, if people would like to, you know, reach out to Karen or Christine or myself, we can email a PDF.
And we did just get a comment that it's a big thank you in all capital letters. Such great info, well organized and helpful. Looking forward to getting the updated PDF. And so that's just another example of how our tools at CCRM are living tools. We're continuously trying to keep them updated. And so if you used to use a tool and you haven't been to it in a while, we encourage you to go back and revisit it, because it may be loaded with new information. And we will certainly get that PDF updated quickly and share that information as part of the webinar follow-up that we'll be doing with everybody. Pam, was there anything else you wanted to add before we go into your next session? Oh, wait, we have another question. Will you let us know when your updated PDF is ready? Fairfax County will want to get that PDF to download and print. Thank you. So yes, we will definitely do that.
As soon as I'm done with all my presentations this month.
Yes.
Probably the beginning of September.
And just want to verify that versioning information will be available on the web page for the PDF handbook. I think by that, we'll make sure the date is very clear, updated, like when was the PDF updated? And this is also going back to the Shoreline Management Model. It's also helpful to have a versioning history, like sort of a track record of the different versions that we've created, so that people know which one they might need to have if they've already got one. So we'll try to make sure we have those threads on clearly labeled on their website and the documents themselves.
Terrific.
Well,
I'm
Pam,
glad people are finding it helpful. That was the point.
yes, it seems so. So Pam, you're on deck for the next.
I am.
If you want to take a deep breath or get a drink of water or anything and transition your presentation. I don't see any other questions right now.
Sure. I can do that. Everybody ready?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
All right. I am starting a timer, so.
Don't worry about that. We have plenty of time.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so, and as for all you Monty Python fans, and now for something completely different. The project I'm going to talk to you right now, I have presented some early preliminary information from this project at other wetlands workshops, so some of the early on stuff might look familiar, but being as we are finally in completing the project, but we do have a no-cost extension, we actually have information to show you that I hope will find you will find useful and interesting. So this project is prioritizing natural nature-based features that increase the resilience of coastal communities to flooding. And my colleague in crime on this project, we've had lots of people participate, but Jessica Hendricks is our main GIS analyst, and she's done just amazing things for this project. So a brief overview. So what was the point of this project? We did get funding from a NOAA Coastal Resilience Grant about 3 years ago. So it had been a 3-year project. And the idea was to support preservation and creation of natural nature-based features as a component of community resilience. And in that process, we wanted to pick 2 relevant benefits. Sometimes they're called co-benefits, sometimes they're called multiple benefits. You know, you can choose your semantics, but I probably will say co-benefits more likely than multiple benefits. The 2 we focused on was water quality and flood insurance services, and the consideration of those 2 services and benefits in our natural nature-based features. And this information was intended to help support locality decision-making by identifying where natural nature-based features already exist that provide multiple benefits, and identifying target areas for restoration and creation of those features. So this process took on 3 primary steps. The first one was finding all the natural nature-based features and the buildings at less than 10 feet elevation in the coastal zone. So then we were going to identify and rank the natural nature-based features for multiple benefits or co-benefits, and then identifying target areas to improve for flood resilience. So what does this look like? So this illustration is a map of our study area. So we picked all lands at elevations less than 10 feet in elevation. And this basically is to represent areas that would be vulnerable to storm-driven tidal flooding based on past storms and for future sea level rise. So in other words, what we wanted to do was identify areas that would be currently potentially flooded by a big nor'easter or certainly a hurricane, but also would project into the future of areas that might be flooded from just sunny day or recurrent flooding. And you can see I do have references for where our data came if you are interested. If you're more the data nerd, as Marcia said, those are on the slide as well. So then the next piece was to map all the natural nature-based features. And so here I will point out that the features that we were focusing on in our study, dunes, beach, we have the Living Shorelines cohort, and I can explain that a little bit more. Wooded, now this is upland woods, not marsh woods, not wetland woods, because that's down here. Scrub shrubs, so these are 2 upland communities. Forested wetland, scrub shrub wetland, emergent wetland, and tidal marsh. So these 3 categories are our non-tidal wetlands. This is our tidal wetland. These are uplands. Now this category does not exist in the land use land cover data set that we used to generate this data. This category is actually built from data that CCRM tracks. So we have a Living Shorelines database that we keep. And the database intends to follow and gather information from all Living Shorelines applications. That information was converted from flat numbers, perhaps linear feet, often linear feet. Usually the application information doesn't provide square footage. Sometimes it does, but often it doesn't. That had to be translated into a polygon, in other words, an aerial extent, and then mapped. So Jess Hendricks developed the data to put this based on the database that Christine Tomlinson keeps for us. And I will note that there's over 350,000 natural nature-based features within the study area, so just below 10 feet. So then the flip side of that is, okay, so we have the natural areas, what about the built infrastructure? And so in this mapping exercise, we have identified over 170,000 primary buildings at elevation less than 10 feet. The reason we use the term primary buildings is because this data was manipulated from a land cover data set or a buildings data set that had that basically shows infrastructure at all scales and sizes. What we did was we modified that data to be able to remove things that would be small from a square footage perspective, so that we were hopefully eliminating things like sheds and detached garages. And so we used a minimum square foot size to be able to represent the buildings, with the intention that the focus was on primary residences, commercial, industrial, and business space, not sheds and garages. So also out of another data set, we identified what are critical community facilities. This is also information that we serve on our Adapt VA integrated viewer. And so that's the same data set. But in this case, we're going to end up using this particular information to help rank our natural nature-based features. So this is how we built the ranking to identify and determine which of the natural nature-based features had the highest multiple benefits. So we looked at 4 components. The first one is the natural nature-based feature flooding mitigation services. and you can see down here in our little chart, and this will go through on my slides, that's based on potential elevation and feature type. So basically, we ran a data set for 19 years of water levels and determined the elevation for the return frequency of flooding. So in other words, how often that elevation would be underwater based on the last 19 years. And then we also considered the capacity of that feature to actually mitigate flooding. Okay, so then the second piece we use to rank is how many buildings does the feature benefit, literally just counting. Are any of the buildings that it benefits a critical community facility? And what are the potential co-benefits for the natural nature-based feature? So I'm going to go through each of those. So first, to find out how many buildings the natural nature-based feature benefits, we linked the buildings through something called the inundation pathway, which depicts the lowest elevation. So we're using LiDAR data to find the lowest line between the waterway, in this case, and the building. So these IPs represent where the flooding would start. In other words, that the flooding is going to come through the lowest elevations first, but not the flooding extent. So for instance, along this shoreline where, in my example, where this is a low point, and this is a low point, and this is a low point, and this is a low point, the flooding will probably come up more like a sheet flow along here. But the idea is, for this building back here, for instance, we get a sense of where that flooding would come through. Where's the low point along here? And that allows to inform decisions about, like for this building, for instance, maybe you could just put something, maybe you could develop something along in here, or of course lift the building. This building, you can see though, there's so many low areas. So buildings can have more than one inundation pathway connecting them to the shoreline. Okay, so our first NNBF total capacity is basically, is capacity times opportunity. So the capacity is based on the features permeability, so how much water it can absorb, surface roughness and vegetation, so in other words, how much wave energy it can diminish. And then, as I said, opportunity is where it sits in the tidal frame. So if the feature is lower in the tidal frame, it's going to intercept storms, all small storms, but will eventually be underwater for bigger storms. If it's in the middle of the tidal frame, it will only intercept certain storms. And if it's higher in elevation, like closer to 8 or 9 feet, it's only going to be, it's only going to have the opportunity to actually provide that service on really big, really high water levels storms and events. And so it's not going to be ranked as high for opportunity. So opportunity basically is how often does the feature actually perform that service. And what we ended up doing with that is just coming up with a numeric ranking. So basically we have, there's tables, there's decision tables behind this. And the numeric ranking has to do with the capacity, which was a decision table. And then opportunity, as I said, is that tidal frame data from the last 19 years, and it's just multiplied, and we end up with, we divide it into three 1/3 percentiles to develop a ranking. So then the next two, which are related to the buildings, how many buildings is affected, are there critical buildings? We go back and we say, how many does it affect? And so we are literally just do a count. And are there critical facilities? So the building data is very interesting because when we started doing the project, we actually developed statistics for all of the buildings and all the NNBFs, and the ranges are pretty broad from considering the diversity of the coastal landscape in Virginia. So more rural areas, you would have maybe lots of NNBFs protecting lots of, single buildings or single buildings, lots of natural nature-based features because the landscape isn't developed. In the urban areas, you might have many buildings that didn't have any natural nature-based features between the waterway and the building. So along the inundation pathway, there were no natural nature-based features. And so because of this, and because we wanted to model all of Virginia, we came up with a really simple ramp. So basically we had statistically, we had a lot of individual buildings below 10 feet in coastal Virginia that have no natural nature-based features. So we have lots of buildings that have natural-based features that protect one building, and then not natural-based features that protect more than one building. And so we used a really simple, if it didn't protect any buildings, it's low. If it protected at least one building, medium, and more than 2 buildings was high. And then for the critical facilities, we just had yes and no. So that was just an additional score if you protected a critical facility. So again, going back to figuring out how do we get those multiple benefits, if we look at the pathway, and we can see here, this is a marsh, and it has all these IPs flowing through it, so it benefits 4 buildings, these 4 buildings. We can also go backwards for each building, how many NMBFs intersect. And so we can see that this building here has NMBF pathways that go through the wooded area here and the marsh here. So we can look at it from both directions. So finally, when we put those together and we want to look at the co-benefits. So this was a little bit the most challenging probably part of, although lots of this was analytically challenging. In order to get at the community rating system co-benefit, we need to understand how much of the special flood hazard area so basically the floodplain area was undeveloped or pervious. And for Virginia, the resource protection area buffer has been considered as also a protected area. So it's considered part of that area that could be counted for pervious versus impervious in terms of determining open space for CRS credits. So we actually did a couple things. So we used data where it already existed, where individual localities had mapped their RPA. We used that existing data, and there was quite a few. But given that Virginia has a pretty diverse, again, coastal landscape, there are lots of local governments that didn't have digital data for their RPAs, and so we wanted to create that area so that we could do the next analysis. And in order to do that, we created a buffer behind all wetlands. So we used the tidal marsh inventory from VIMS, the National Wetlands Inventory to find adjacent non-tidal wetlands, so where there's a hydrology continuum. And then we used the National Hydrologic Data Set to find out if they were connected by surface water, because it has to be connected. And then we built a 100-foot buffer landward for those localities that didn't already have one. Okay, and the idea behind that was to be able to get to this first credit, which is potentially qualifying NMBFs that are in the 100-year flood zone and overlay the resource protection area. So that's one of our co-benefits. And then the second one is the water quality credit potential. And this one we actually went really simple with. Basically, all the vegetated natural nature-based features were given water quality potential, and the non-vegetated beaches and dunes not because they're necessarily non-vegetated, but because they're so high up in the frame elevation-wise. So we came up with that option for those. Here's another example. So drilling down a little bit into the CRS credits, you can see that this shows an example of where the open space is, and so the darker colors, and then you can see the lighter colors are turf grass. We also did include agriculture as a land cover, because the TMDL crediting, which comes in the water quality side of the house, is different if it's an urban landscape versus an agricultural landscape. So you can see in this example here that these darker green are already open space. And so if this locality, this happens to be Norfolk, but if this locality were looking to be able to calculate how much open space was in their special flood hazard area in order to try to qualify for those CRS credits, we could literally just do an analysis for them based on this mapping. We could provide them, or we could give them the data and they could do the analysis. So they could determine how much of this is open space and how much isn't. And if it's turf grass, it also allows us to identify places where you could potentially put in a natural nature-based feature. So that leads to the second part of the analysis. So the flip side of this is, so now that we've ranked our NNBFs, we also want to look at where there are target areas to replace natural nature-based features. And again, the target areas are based on places where there's no natural nature-based feature between the building and the waterway. This is actually a reasonably highly urban area that I'm showing in this frame. So you can see that there's many places along the shoreline where there's buildings that don't have any natural nature-based features, because those are the ones that are in the darker green or the blue. Like here's a wetland, here's a wetland. But this reaches shoreline, because it's so developed, doesn't have any natural nature-based features along the inundation pathways for those buildings. So we chose to focus on the shoreline location. Now, understandably, we know that the study area goes up to 10 feet in elevation. And so anywhere along a pathway up to 10 feet elevation, you could implement a natural nature-based feature creation or restoration project, and it would improve the resilience for any of the features landward of that. But in order for us to pick something that was, that we could, take a bite of with this 3-year project that has a lot of very complicated data, we chose to start with the shoreline first. The shoreline is our first line of defense. It's basically where the water hits the road. Number one. Number two, we have a lot of information about the shoreline because of our shoreline management model and our comprehensive coastal inventory. And number three, if it's right along the shoreline, it's most likely to be in an area that would be considered inside the buffer or immediately proximal to the waterway and eligible for TMDL credits. So that's why we started with the shoreline first. Now here's an example from Norfolk and Little Creek, and you can see that there's a lot of target opportunities here. There's a lot of buildings and infrastructure that have no natural nature-based features along their inundation pathways. When you click on these areas, you can actually see, and it will tell you what it will do if you were to implement a natural nature-based feature along there. It will tell you what benefits you will get. So this particular one right here, it says one building will benefit. So I think this links to a building right behind. Now, of course, you can see there's a lot of pavement here. So obviously the pavement would benefit as well, although that wasn't the point of the research. Our research was to look for buildings, and arguably you might have to get rid of some of your pavement in order to create a natural nature-based feature to protect the building. It tells you what the cover is, and the cover is important again because the focus of creating natural nature-based features is in urban landscapes is conversion, and in rural landscapes is turf and agriculture, potentially cropland. So where you're creating a natural nature-based feature, you're creating it out of some other impacted or managed area. It tells you, in this case, you'd expand your marsh. And then it also says what the recommendation is from the Shoreline Management Model. Now, in this case, it says it's highly modified, so seek expert advice. And it notes that this is a marina. So this particular example is a complicated one, but a lot of them are complicated. So we don't want to avoid the complicated examples. So here's a second example, and it reiterates what we were talking about with why we chose to work on the shoreline first over here. And you can see in this example, we have, there's a gap here. So you can see this is tidal marsh, and then there's no marsh, and then this is a wooded area. And so then there's these houses back here. And basically, if you were to implement something, you could benefit 5 buildings, and at least one of those buildings has no other protection. It says that the existing is impervious and turf, so it's paved and turf grass. And it tells you what the existing natural-based features are, so it gives you an idea of what to shoot for. So in this case, tidal marsh and wooded. It says what the shoreline recommendation is for the shoreline management model, which is non-structural living shoreline. That's because this is such a quiet waterway. And it also talks about adding natural features to existing structures if you can enhance any of the hardened structures that are already there. So our next steps, as I pointed out, that there's a couple things that this model doesn't do at this point. We don't add sea level rise projections in. This model was modeled now. We are sort of considering where sea level might go by modeling up to 10 feet, but there's no explicit location projected for the existing natural nature-based features. And we've proposed to do that work so we can see where our marshes and wooded areas might move to, and then know what we need to build in response to that movement. We would want to add other co-benefits. So we focused on the CRS and the water quality benefits, but we are interested in, and lots of people are interested in, things like RTE species habitats, habitat corridors, other flood buffering benefits. So we consider those. Also, because we use the inundation pathway process, which links the water to a feature, we did not model things like offshore, like SAV, or offshore small barrier islands or spits. We understand that they do provide services to the communities on the landward side, but we used an inundation pathway process, so we would have to use a different analysis to incorporate these, and it's something we're very interested in doing. And then obviously to look at moving away from the shoreline into the upland to identify other areas for natural nature-based feature creation moving forward. So, oh, and you can ask Jessica questions. I guess I forgot to change that last slide. So if you have any questions, ask Jessica.
Well, thank you, Pam. And we do have a question that, since Jess isn't here, we'll have to ask you.
Okay.
One of the questions came at the beginning when you were talking about the study area being at 10 feet. What elevation datum reference are you using? NAVD 88 or mean lower low water? What was the reference?
NAVD 88. They're topographic data. They're land-based datums, geodetic-based datum.
And the reason why we use that was so that it is a reference elevation that's familiar to people with the land-based buildings.
Right, because it's going to be based on the infrastructure and the buildings.
And another question that just came up, which is of course a good one, is this tool available online? And I can answer that by saying not just yet. We're working on a product to post this online. We're in the final stages of preparation for the output, and we will make this tool available online through one of our portals, and we'll certainly widely advertise that when it's available. And then I have another question for you, Pam. Will this tool allow us to download the results for our local community so that we can share the results internally with our staff?
So the way we are planning to serve the information, and I guess I did leave this slide out because I modified it from before. So the data is going to be served through the Adapt Virginia integrated viewer. If you're familiar with that, and if you're not, that's where it will be. So it's adaptva.com or adaptva.org, and there's under the tools section of that, there's an integrated viewer. And what we are doing is modifying the existing viewer, which currently has 5 data layers, to have a 6th data layer. And we're integrating the natural nature-based features data. So the buildings information, the natural nature-based feature ranking information, and the targeting information, along with a couple other data sets, are being integrated into that viewer. And so that's where all this information will sit. And the process for integrating into that viewer enables, for that viewer, we also have enabled data downloading. So we'll have first of all, there'll be a metadata for it. And second of all, there's an information box on that site. And in the information box, you can read about the data, figure out where it came from, and then we'll provide access to it there. So also it's also possible to then just query or request or send an email for certain data sets, and we can handle it that way through FTP or some sort of cloud sharing, or however we need to do that. So there should be more than one way to access the data.
And we have one more question for you, Pam. Do you account for whether the areas in the target areas for new NNBFs are publicly or privately owned?
That's a good question. I'm trying to remember, you know, we've used so many different data sets along in this process. And I know at one point we did identify already conserved lands, and we do have that data. So we do know if a target's in an area that's already conserved, frequently already conserved, frequently that's publicly owned, but sometimes it's just an easement. So I'm not sure, frankly, but I can get that answer to you and get back with you on that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Pam.
Mhm.
So in the few minutes that we have left, we're going to do a wrap up. We welcome your feedback about all of the featured tools in today's webinar. We encourage your questions and comments and feedback. Links to all of these tools were provided in your webinar reminder messages. And there's several ways that you can let us know what we can do to improve these tools in our advisory services for you. You can enter a chat box message or a Q&A in the few minutes that we have left for this webinar today. You can complete a post-webinar evaluation survey that we'll be sending around after the whole series is complete to everybody that registered. You can also contact the presenters directly, and their email is, email messages can be sent to either Pam or Marcia, and here is their email contact information. You can also send an email to ccrminfo@vims.edu, and any questions or feedback or comments you can send there as well. We encourage you to visit our website at www.vims.edu/ccrm. And I think our presenters pointed out some of the other materials in addition to these tools that you can find on our website. I thank the two presenters again today, Pam and Marcia. Thank you very much for sharing these tools with us. Special thanks to Cersei Gonzalez, who helped as a producer behind the scenes. And certainly thanks to all of you participants who tuned in today. We hope you come back for the next two webinars to hear more about current events and updates in the tidal shoreline management community. Registration is still open for the next two webinars. We encourage you to share the information with anyone who might be interested. Goodbye for now, and have a great day and stay safe.